Okay, I guess we're going to get started. Sure, people will be slowly sneaking in. Thank you all for coming. Miro Chamutano, I'm the project associate for the Cold War International History Project in the History and Public Policy program. At the Wilson Center, Christian Osterman, the director, is out today. He extends his regrets for not being able to be here and chair this event, but it gives me this incredible opportunity to chair this this event that's actually pretty dear to my heart. For those of you who don't know, the Cold War International History Project at the Wilson Center was established in 1991 with a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. Its mission is to obtain and disseminate documents from the former communist countries and make them available to integrate the historical evidence from the so-called other side with the historiography of the Cold War that's been written in the West. We've been, I think, fairly successful with a great deal of help from our friends at the National Security Archive, who have been both an inspiration and a great deal of help over the years in moving this project forward. We've cooperated with them over the years in numerous instances, and I think including in some with obtaining some of the documents that Thomas Svetlana will be discussing here today. The other part of the mission of the project is to bring to the Washington community and more recently to the world through the World Wide Web discussions on pertinent topics in history, including book launches and conferences and so on. One such book launch we have here today. Let me briefly introduce to you the speakers. I'm going to start with Tom Blanton. He's the director of the National Security Archive at the George Washington University. He served as the archive's first director of planning and research beginning in 1986 and became executive director in 1992. He filed his first Freedom of Information Act request in 1976 as a weekly newspaper reporter in Minnesota, and among many hundreds subsequently. He filed the FOIA request and subsequent lawsuit with the Public Citizens Litigation Group that forced the release of Oliver North's Iran-Contra diaries in 1990. His books include White House Email, the top-secret computer messages that Reagan and Bush White House tried to destroy. He co-authored the chronology on the Iran-Contra affair, served as a contributing author to 3 editions of the ACLU's authoritative guide, Litigation under the Federal Open Government Laws, and is a contributing author to the Brookings Institution study, Atomic Audit, The Cost and Consequences of U.S. Nuclear Weapons since 1940. He is the founding editorial board member of freedominfo.org, the virtual network of international freedom of information advocates, and serves on the editorial board of Diplo. Next to him is Svetlana Savranskaya. She's a research fellow at the George Washington University's National Security Archive, where she directs its cooperative projects with the Russian archives and institutes and edits the Russian and East Bloc archival document database, RADREAD for those of you in the know. She earned her PhD in political science and international affairs in 1998 from Emory University and worked as the Hewitt Fellow at the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta. While completing her PhD, she served as a research associate and interpreter for several National Security Archive Cold War International History Project joint efforts, including most prominently the Carter-Brezhnev project of Brown University's Watson Institute, as well as the End of the Cold War project. She is a Russian citizen who has won several fellowships and awards during her graduate studies, including a prestigious dissertation fellowship from the Institute for the Study of World Politics in Moscow. Commenting today on the book is David Hoffman, who's the foreign editor of the Washington Post and currently a contributing editor at the Washington Post and Foreign Policy magazine. Hoffman came to Washington in 1977 to cover Congress and later served as the Washington correspondent for the San Jose Mercury News. He covered Reagan's campaign for the presidency in 1980 and was the national economics correspondent for Knight Riders newspaper. 1982, Hoffman joined the Washington Post to cover the Reagan presidency. As a White House correspondent, he covered the major U.S.-Soviet summits of the Reagan years, including Geneva and Reykjavik, as well as domestic policy and politics. He also covered the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency, was diplomatic correspondent at the time the Soviet Union collapsed, served as Jerusalem correspondent, also covering the Oslo peace talks, and from 1995 to 2001, he served as Moscow's as bureau chief in Moscow. His books include The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in the New Russia, and The Dead Hand, Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy, which was awarded the 2010 Pulitzer Prize. We're all here today to discuss the latest book from as part of the Masterpieces of History Cold War Readers. It's the one right here, The Peaceful End of the Cold War in Europe. And I'm going to turn that over to Tom, I guess. 20 minutes, roughly. Solve the Cold War for us in 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mircea, so much. It's a great honor for us to be here today and to bring this book, because this book is really an expression of what is a global revolution in archival sources. And in that global revolution, Mircea and the Cold War International History Project and the Wilson Center have been vanguard cadres, the vanguard party in many ways, and are proud partners in many, many, many of these endeavors. So it's especially gratifying to be hosted here today for this book launch and to bring some of these sources on the Cold War, many of which have never been seen by scholars before our project, and present them here. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and thanks to Christian. I'm sorry Christian can't be here. He's doing hardship duty in Florence, Italy. I was going to recommend that we move the entire book launch there. We could suffer through that. It would be a lot of fun. I want to just say one quick comment about our title. We at the National Security Archive are actually very modest and humble people, and you wouldn't know it from the title of the book, which is Masterpieces of History. And it's not that we're claiming that our book is itself a masterpiece. Rather, we take our title and our quotation and much of our inspiration from a wonderful observation by the Canadian scholar Jacques Levesque, who said with some irony that he thought maybe the best thing the Soviet Union ever did was the way in which it dissolved its empire, that is to say, peacefully. And in any case, Levesque said, these episodes of 1989 are masterpieces of history. So we came to these episodes by virtue of partnerships all over Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union with former dissidents, former scholars, former reformed communists, and an entire international, I would say, global movement for openness of sources. And as we looked into each one of the crises of communism, we looked at the 1953, the great first workers' revolt against the dictatorship of the proletariat, when the proletariat itself rose up. Fascinating moment. Christian edited the book that came out of that extraordinary conference and research project. We looked at 1956, the transformational Hungarian Revolution that then came back in 1989 as a renewed public debate about what happened in Hungary. And we, with cooperation from the 1956 Institute and others in Hungary, opened up extraordinary sources in Hungarian and Russian and English and German on 1956 and sort of told a whole new history with primary sources. We looked at 1968 and the invasion of Prague by the Soviet Army and the socialism with a human face and its antecedents and how and why it did not come back in 1989, that whole dynamic. We looked at 1980 and 81 when Poland really led the way toward the end of the Cold War with the rise of solidarity and the largest mass movement against communism in that history has ever seen. Really extraordinary and nonviolent as well. And in each case, after those conferences, after the publication of those books, after the postings on the webs, after the mountains of sources, everything from verbatim transcripts of the roundtable discussions to the cables from the U.S. ambassadors back to Washington and their instructions, to the reports to Gorbachev and the Politburo about these different countries, at the end of each of these chronological, if you will, approaches, our partners said to us, so what about 1989? What does this tell us about what happened when the wall came down, when the Stalinist system collapsed? What can you tell us? And by the way, what were those superpowers doing in that time? Because there was a perception, and our book shows it to be very real, in addition to being a perception, of a pause in the superpower relations. And I think you will see, if you look closely at our evidence, one of the arguments that we make, that we draw from this evidence, is that pause between the superpowers actually was quite enabling. It created a kind of vacuum into which the East Europeans, both reformed communists and dissidents, could rush and make their own revolutions. And one of our arguments is that, in fact, the United States policy and United States positions did not play much of a role in 1989, these revolutionary events. And I should just say, this book is 122 documents out of what are probably 122,000 documents, or 1,220,000 documents, if you counted them all up, from what we've excavated and what our partners have come up with. It's the tip of an iceberg. And to really belabor this metaphor, and this is one of my favorite things in the world, is take a metaphor and just flog it into the ground. This is the tip of an iceberg of evidence, and that iceberg is sinking some ocean liners. And there are two big Titanics in American historiography and public discourse, which deserve to be sunk by the iceberg of evidence. And one of those Titanics is the myth of the Reagan pressure on the Soviet Union leading to its collapse. And the other Titanic that deserves to be sunk by this evidence is the myth of the Bush administration as, to use President Bush's own phrase, it's the first Bush, we were a responsible catalyst for the revolutions of 1989. Au contraire is what this book says. And let me just go into that very briefly, because on the Reagan pressure notion, the New York Times on November 9th, just this past November 9th, the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, had a big piece, I think Steve Erlanger wrote it, basically saying, well, now most Americans believe that Ronald Reagan tore down the wall. When I appeared on the Stephen Colbert show, Colbert gave direct illustration of these. He says, oh yeah, I remember Ronald Reagan. He's the guy that karate chopped the Berlin Wall. Yes, exactly. A lot of myths around this. But what this book shows, in addition to the domestic politics quotient back of Reagan's speech, Mr. Secretary, tear down this wall, he was trying to recover from the Iran-Contra scandal. He couldn't get his Supreme Court nominee through. He needed to take to the high ground. And I think one of the interesting themes that comes through this evidence is the degree to which domestic politics mattered almost more than international relations to most leaders, including even Gorbachev. But the Reagan pressure theory does not hold up when you go through the complete series of Politburo transcripts, the memcons of Gorbachev with foreign leaders, and the dynamic between them, the diary of Anatoly Chernayev, top Gorbachev advisor. And I need to say a special thank you to him, because his generosity with sources, his willingness to open himself up to attack on the basis of the complete diaries is just extraordinary. It's a degree of willingness to submit yourself to the judgment of history and to help historians that is entirely missing among most of our top policymakers. You look at those diaries and you look at the interaction effect of the United States, and you see that the pressure from the United States actually had a reverse effect on reform dynamics in the Soviet Union, empowered hardliners, reduced the possibilities of opening. And yet, when Gorbachev finally connects with Reagan at Geneva in November 1985, some really interesting things happen. Gorbachev concludes, well, on the one hand, Reagan's a little bit of a caveman, he has a little bit of Paleolithic thinking and all this, but wow, he really believes, Reagan really believes, and this was news to Gorbachev, in nuclear abolition. He wants to get rid of the nuclear weapons. And this had an amazing effect, so much so that by early January 1986, according to Chernayev's diary, which we publish here in this book, Chernayev writes in his diary, you know, Gorbachev understands that if we disarmed tomorrow, Reagan would not attack. If we disarmed tomorrow, Reagan would not attack. January 1986. At some level, that of the emotional, psychological, this is the end of the Cold War. If the enemy won't attack, even if you're helpless, even if you're disarmed, then what's the purpose of your security apparatus? What's the purpose of your East European empire? What's the purpose of your thousands of nuclear weapons? What's the purpose of the whole repression on which the Soviet Union was founded? So you look at the way in which the interaction with Reagan reduces the Soviet sense of threat. Gorbachev in January of '86 proposes a formal nuclear abolition program. After Reykjavik, he gives some specific dates for abolition of nuclear weapons. Nobody in the U.S. government, except for Ronald Reagan, is in favor of this, apparently. And you see this back and forth, and that's one of the really interesting themes that we tease out from the evidence, that the missed opportunities time after time on the U.S. side for what Gorbachev was actually proposing, which was an arms race in reverse. The other great theme, I won't belabor that further, but just to say I think it's the interaction with Reagan around nuclear abolition that has a far more profound effect on easing the sense of threat and changing Gorbachev's notions of security than any pressure the United States brought. And I think we can show that from the Soviet side, and that's a fascinating dynamic. There is evidence of the pressure, there is evidence of the mutual fright, there are constant flare-ups and the like, but a core theme is that theme of we don't have anything to be scared of anymore. And that's fascinating. And that leads to some of the things that Svetlana will talk about in terms of Gorbachev's strategic vision. Now, the Bush responsible catalyst idea. This is a claim that some quite good scholars and folks like Philip Zelikow and others have made with somewhat more persuasive power on German unification. But when you look at the record of 1989, I think those documents show, and we publish documents like the Polish record of Bush's meeting with Jaruzelski in the summer of 1989. We publish records like Gorbachev talking to other European leaders like Mitterrand about Bush and what is he doing. And over and over, the message that comes through about American policy and American thinking in 1989 is fundamental anxiety about stability. So much so that it's not only a pause in superpower relations that we establish, I think, through this evidence, but actual breaks on what the revolutionaries and the dissidents are trying to do. So when Bush meets with Jaruzelski, he's incredibly supportive in July of 1989. Please become the president. This is the former dictator. Please become the president of Poland. We support you in this, right? At a time when it wasn't clear what kind of government would form. And people within Solidarity were willing to go much, much further. When he goes to Hungary, he finds an affinity with Nemeth and the other reform communists. But when he meets with the dissidents, he's scared to death. He writes down in his diary, the idea that these guys could be running this country? Are you kidding? Right? On the airplane back from that Eastern European trip, he writes in his diary, I better reach out to Gorbachev. We've put off this kind of summit meeting for some time. We don't want to be working on his agenda or let him have the initiative. But events are moving way too fast in Eastern Europe. They're going to get out of control. These dissident types want to really push it a lot further than we would be comfortable with. So we got to put the brakes on there, slow it down. It's a fascinating dynamic. And of course, by the time they do finally manage to meet, the wall's already fallen, revolution's out of their hands. I think this was kind of enabling, but it was enabling the revolutions by default, by pausing and even trying to slow them down. And so even you go to a moment like November 9th when the wall is falling, it's a fascinating moment. We publish a couple of the documents from that day so you can be in the room. The Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Kohl, is actually not in Germany on the day the Berlin Wall fell. Guess where he is? He's in Warsaw. He's meeting with Lech Wałęsa. And Wałęsa, before they get news of the wall falling, Wałęsa says to Kohl, you can read the whole thing verbatim in here. I'll just paraphrase. Wałęsa says, things are just moving way too fast in Berlin and East Germany. You guys got to do, you really need to slow this down because, why? The wall could fall in a couple of weeks. It was actually going to be a couple hours, right? The wall could fall. And if the wall falls, then U.S. Germans won't be available to give us Poles any more financial aid. We're going to be stuck. Everybody's going to forget about us. And we led the revolution. We've been doing this for 10 years. You're going to abandon us because you're going to go absorb East Germany. Lo and behold, right? Kohl flies back to Germany that night as they were watching on CNN the wall coming down. It's a fascinating moment. Anxiety in Warsaw. Look at Bush's press conference on television, anxiety in Washington. It's not just that he says to the TV cameras, I'm not an emotional guy. They were scared to death. the European order was coming down, high anxiety. There were some expressions of joy other than at the wall itself. In fact, there was one in Moscow that Svetlana will tell you about. And it's a fascinating contrast about what was happening in November. I'll just throw out a couple more revelations because if you read the coverage of the anniversary of the Berlin Wall falling last November, you will have seen quotes from a dozen of these documents because we believe in making them public to everybody. We've had versions of this manuscript for years and years. Our original conference that set the research agenda for this manuscript was at the Musgrove Conference Center in 1998. And the edited transcript of that conference, which included Jack Matlock and Doug McKechen on the U.S. side, and included Anatoly Chernyayev and the late Georgy Shakhnazarov and Sergei Tarasenko on the Soviet side, being confronted by all our East European scholarly partners asking him, what in the world were you guys thinking? What were you doing? Was there a superpower condominium and so forth? And that conference set the research agenda. We went out to try to answer those questions, gather the documents. Thanks to Chernyaev's and others of the officials' generosity, we've answered, I think, a lot of those. Revelations in this book. Here are the first published verbatim transcripts of Henry Kissinger's attempt to create a superpower condominium in January 1989. It's been known about, reported by various journalists. Here you can read what Kissinger actually proposed to Yakovlev. You can read what Kissinger and Bush talked about. You can read Gorbachev's, well, he's interested if this really is a message from Bush, if this really is engagement. He's looking to get any kind of engagement with Bush. Instead, he gets a pause, a stop. You can see what they were talking about, and clearly there was interest on both sides to manage those unruly East Europeans. Thank goodness they didn't. There's wonderful revelations like the September 23rd, 1989 meeting between Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev, where Thatcher says, things in Germany are just moving too fast. There are demonstrations in Leipzig, unification on the signs. She says, this would be terrible. This is bad for Europe. She says to Chernyayev, stop taking notes. Stop taking notes. I'm telling you, nobody's in favor of unification. I talked to my friend George in Washington. He's not in favor. Nobody's in favor of unification. And Gorbachev said, well, wait a second. Well, what about that? NATO just did a communique. Thatcher says, pay no attention to the words in that NATO communique. Nobody wants those Germans to get together. Well, you can sit in the room and read what they said to each other. Chernyayev went out in the hallway and wrote down, of course, everything she said, and we translated it and published it here. And that's the power, I think, of these documents, even though they are the tip of the iceberg, which is they restore some of the sense of contingency with which we should always be looking at the past. They restore some of the sense of choice that policymakers had at the time, which we forget because we're looking back with hindsight. We think it must have had to have turned out that way. In fact, there were many forks of the road. There were many opportunities for this to go off track. There were many moments where violence could have erupted, where a stone could have hit a policeman, where a bullet could have been fired. You might have had a very, very different dynamic. It wasn't completely, out of bounds for the White House to have felt so anxious about these events. These were revolutionary events. They were extraordinary. And our attempt here is to bring you back into those rooms, to bring you back into that sense of history, to put you face to face with these artifacts. Not that they're so true, but they are frozen in time as evidence, as documents. And I will just end with the exhortation that has become a mantra of practically every event that we've ever done with the Cold War International History Project, which is our favorite. Some of our T-shirts read Documentos o Muerte, which is one of our motives in life. But the other one is Archives of the World Unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. But I'd like to turn it over to Svetlana now to tell you what the real findings are about Soviet and Gorbachev foreign policy as a protagonist of these extraordinary events, these masterpieces of history.
Thank you, and thank you for a wonderful introduction, Mircea. As Tom just pointed out, we were very, very lucky with our partners in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And if you look at this book, you will notice then that maybe 20 documents, maybe between 20 and 30, are documents from the U.S. side. And the rest of the documents come from the former Soviet, Russian archives now, and from Eastern Europe. And we're especially grateful to the Gorbachev Foundation that gave us highest level of access and still remains the most open archive in Russia, even at the time when most archives are closing. So looking at this really rich material, what did we find? And of course I could talk about it for hours. I hope we will raise a lot of issues in the questions period. But I would like to concentrate on major revelations that we found looking at these documents over the last almost 10 years. First of all, and also there are lots of myths on the Soviet side too. And the issue of the end of the Cold War in Europe, especially after the NATO expansion to the east, became a highly politicized issue. And a lot of domestic discussion in Russia now is colored with very intense ideological positions. So we hope also that our book will provide some material for people, even in Russia, those who read English, to reflect on those events and look at the documents. So some of the main findings from these documents are that the change in the Soviet policy to Eastern Europe, the re-evaluation of this policy began very early, and that the main decisions, the main principal decisions, were made in 95-96. Now, 85-86, thank you very much. 85 and 86. Well, most people would say, why didn't we see them? For several reasons. First of all, Eastern Europe was never a priority for Gorbachev and his advisors. Even though ideologically, if you follow the Marxist thinking, they should be putting the issue of Eastern Europe and socialism at the top of their agenda. They said so in Politburo meetings, but in fact, Eastern Europe was far, far down at their list of priorities. What were the main ones? Of course, the first one was the domestic reform. And as many times in Russian history, the reformers understood that the modernization that they so badly needed for their country could only come in cooperation with the West. Gorbachev took it one step further, in integration with the West. He wanted to integrate into Europe, and Eastern Europe was seen as kind of a first step in that integration. But it was not a place where there was some urgency. So domestic reform. He wanted, his second priority was to end the arms race and engage in really deep arms control with Reagan. As Tom pointed out, Gorbachev was also an abolitionist, and this interaction on the basis of the shared idea, an idea which was very alien to a lot of people around both Reagan and Gorbachev, idea that you can actually get rid of nuclear weapons and live in a non-nuclear world, created this basis for unique cooperation. And Gorbachev liked to believe that major issues, major conflicts could be resolved in interaction, in cooperation. That also applied to his thinking about third world conflicts and about Eastern Europe. Secondly, and probably one of the most interesting outcomes of our research is that the use of force. A lot of people ask the question, why didn't Gorbachev use force? Was it considered? When was it considered? Because in Eastern Europe, the population, and especially the dissidents, believed that at some point there will be a limit of tolerance of the Soviet regime. And the Brezhnev doctrine would be used again, because nobody publicly said Brezhnev doctrine is not valid any longer. In fact, in all the documents we looked at, we never found a single proposal to use force or use any kind of coercion in Eastern Europe. In fact, we constantly see that Gorbachev and his closest advisors were expressing themselves in a way of saying it's unacceptable. Any pressure, any use of force is unacceptable, and in fact it would ruin everything we already achieved. It would ruin even our domestic reform effort, and of course it would ruin trust to perestroika internationally. Use of force was unthinkable for them. But okay, well, knowing Gorbachev and liberal advisors who were around him, maybe it's not that surprising. But I looked at every single Politburo record during 1985-1991. Not even Yazov, not even Kryuchkov, not even any hardliner ever once mentioned, why don't we either use force or threaten to use force? Why would they not do that? Why would they not propose? Because as early as June 1986, Gorbachev sent a special memorandum, General Secretary's memorandum, to the Politburo. It's a very rare type of document. It's a programmatic document where the General Secretary sets the line. And he says the methods of 1956 and 1968 will not work any longer and they are unacceptable. And of course, in the Soviet hierarchical system, after the General Secretary set the line, you don't go ahead and say, well, why don't we use troops in country A? Another major revelation, and the one that for me personally was very interesting as a globally missed opportunity, is the idea of the common European home. What struck me long time ago when I was still writing my dissertation is that I keep seeing discussions of the common European home and integration into Europe at the time, but then when I asked decision makers later, they said, oh, well, you know, nothing came out of it, it was not a serious concept. In the work on this book, I discovered that not only it was a serious concept, it probably was the most powerful explanatory variable of why the Cold War in Europe ended peacefully and why Gorbachev did not try to prevent reform, why he did not put pressure on more and more radical reform, and why he reacted the way he reacted to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Because in his mind, this process would be a gradual process to European integration and building a new European security system, which he seriously believed in. His plan, along with the plan for nuclear abolition, was that by 1995, both blocs, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, will become political organizations, will renounce their military structures and will become political organizations. And by the year 2000, they will be subsumed into this new European security structure. And Russia, the Soviet Union, reformed democratic Soviet Union, would be equal partner of major European countries in this integrationist scheme. He delivered his Strasbourg address in July 1989, all about his dream of united Europe, quoting Victor Hugo, talking about human rights and norms, universal human rights, freedoms, as the basis of this new European home. Well, some of it, now looking back on what actually happened, the Warsaw Pact fell apart, was dissolved by its own constituent elements, and NATO expanded, and there is really no grounds for the idea of a common European home as it stands right now. But at the time, we see a lot of agreement in his conversations. You will see here conversations with people as diverse as Mitterrand and Margaret Thatcher and Gonzalez, supporting the common European home. In fact, Václav Havel comes to Moscow in February 1990 and also talks about the need to disband both military organizations and make sure that American troops also leave Europe and that new European structure will be built. And he tells Gorbachev, I just spoke about it in the US Congress and I told them that American troops are not welcome in Europe, and they applauded. And Gorbachev says, I see we share the same thoughts. Mitterrand clearly was supporting this idea. So for a period of time, this was not just an idea, it was a real task that the Soviets thought that they were working toward. Now, if you want to build a common European home, you can't use force in that European home, because if you do, you undermine your own prospects for integration with Europe. And also, because the common European home would be built on universal human values, it's actually good if the European countries reform in a democratic direction. Gorbachev partly liked the idea of condominium because he liked these plans, schemes, designs where several major powers would cooperate and move gradually. And he put a lot of trust in that. And so when the Berlin Wall falls down, the Politburo actually is not even talking about the events in Germany. What they're fearing is that Russia itself might collapse. The Prime Minister says, when we should fear is not the Baltics, but Russia and Ukraine. I smell an overall collapse in Russia. So at the moment, in the fall of 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall was not the major shock, because if the wall falls, but the European process still goes on, and at the end of this process there will be a gradual integration of the Soviet Union into the European structures, the fall of the wall really is not catastrophic. In fact, it's not even against the Soviet interests. Now, another major revelation, I think, that we found looking at Soviet and East European documents is how aware the Soviets were of actual reform processes in the countries of Eastern Europe, especially in Poland and Hungary. In Poland, the Soviets, in the late summer of 1988, were informed about the beginnings of the idea of the round table process. In fact, when Joseph Chirek came to Moscow in the end of September 1988 to talk about it with Gorbachev, Gorbachev completely supported the process. He even encouraged engaging solidarity, engaging the opposition, engaging the church, and moving slowly. In the case of Hungary, when Miklos Nemeth comes to Moscow in March 1989, he says to Gorbachev, well, in fact, we are thinking of dismantling the electronic defenses on the border. Gorbachev does not react saying, what are you doing? Because this is really the beginning of the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is the beginning of the fall of the Iron Curtain. He responds to him, he says, yes, we're thinking of reforming of changing our arrangements on the border too. And also Nemeth tells him in that conversation that we're thinking in the future of multi-party elections. And instead of saying, oh no, this is unacceptable, as they would say in 1956 and 68, and even in 1980 in Poland, Gorbachev said, yes, our own elections are scheduled in the end of March. And in fact, the first multi-candidate, partially free elections, some Russians would tell you that these were the freest elections that we ever had. They happened in Moscow. They happened in Russia in March of 1989. And that sent a signal to Eastern Europe. Then you can do the same, because that's what Gorbachev wanted them to do. He wanted them to do a version of perestroika which would go a little further than Russian perestroika. As he told the Poles, you are our testing grounds. We're looking at what you're doing because we, in a year or two, will be doing the same. Once the Soviet elections happened, once 85% of communist bureaucrats lost their seats and major opponents of Gorbachev came to the parliament, the Poles knew that the Soviets would not interfere in any way in their elections. The Hungarians knew that the Soviets, and in fact in our documents we have conversations between the members of the Warsaw Pact, between the leaders saying to each other that we know that use of force from the Soviet Union is not possible. In fact, it's our opposition now that is cheering for the Soviet perestroika. So this set a chain of events that if you just use the realist analysis, you would say, well, the Eastern Europe is getting out of control. But from the Soviet point of view, it wasn't getting out of control. As long as there was no violence, as long as the European process, the common European home process was going on, it did not threaten the interests of the Soviet Union. This is how they envisioned it. And I would end with the unification of Germany, because it's a very interesting process and only small part of our documents is dealing with unification of Germany. However, the unification of Germany was in a way the end to the hope, Gorbachev's hope of common European home. And even though it seemed from the Soviet Union that it's all for the good, as Chernyayev said, the total dismantling of socialism as a world phenomenon has been taking place. Perhaps it is inevitable and good, for this is a reunification of mankind on the basis of common sense. So to them, it didn't look threatening. But in fact, what was happening is that German unification took away the focus of interest and became the main dynamics of the European processes in 1990. And once it was clear that Germany would be in NATO, then, of course, the idea of mutual dismantling of both blocs was disappearing, and East Europeans, rather than trying for the two-pronged, two-anchor structure in Europe, realized that it was in their interest to integrate with Western Europe, European Union, if not, then NATO, as soon as possible, and in effect abandon their former ally, or, technically ally. And very late in the 1990-91, the Soviets are faced with the fact that European integration will be happening, but without them. And that brings us back to the sense of missed opportunity, where maybe, and of course this is all what ifs, but it looked for a small moment in 1989 and 90 that the Soviet Union or Russia would actually be integrated in the European security system, would be integrated economically, and that did not happen. And a lot of it in Russia brought this huge backlash against the internationalism of Gorbachev, brought back the accusations of losing Eastern Europe, brought the accusations of betrayals of Soviet national interests by Gorbachev and his administration, and in some long term resulted in semi-isolation of Russia, which happened under the Putin administration. Thank you.
Well, a big thanks to the Cold War International History Project and to the authors for coming here today to talk about their book. I have to confess that I'm very, very fond of the National Security Archive and spent time there and benefited enormously from their assistance with my own work and my own research. The National Security Archive didn't exist when I came to Washington, and today it's a vital Washington institution. In fact, it's so vital that many people around the world think it's a U.S. government archive. And a continuing headache, I know, for Tom when people think that it's really part of the government. But in my citations in my book, I made sure to put a T in front of NSA, TNSA, so no one would confuse it with the other NSA. And you're probably more valuable. The book actually is 3 parts. One part is the documents, another part is the very valuable edited transcript of the Musgrove Conference on the end of the Cold War. But the 2 real masterpieces, which I think the authors are too modest to describe as masterpieces, are their essays. There are 2 very large and really skillful historical essays, one by Svetlana, one by Tom, in this book, which I'm going to address today. And I think that's both of them are a really important contribution to this entire long period of trying to understand what happened at the end of the Cold War. And I think Svetlana's words about missed opportunities ought to be the headline over these 2 essays, because that's really what they're about, and I'd like to address them both. First, Svetlana's essay. It's very, very clear from the documents and from your work that one of the absolutely most important things that sprung forth in these early years of Gorbachev was this refusal to use force, this unwillingness to follow the Brezhnev doctrine. And I think that if we look back at certainly these wonderful Politburo discussions and Gorbachev's own conversations with other leaders, you see the fact that he didn't agonize over this. This is not a policy, in my view, which somehow evolved out of great deal of hand-wringing or even real experience in those years. In fact, I would posit that one of the remarkable things about the Gorbachev policy of non-use of force is that actually it was already baked in the cake when Gorbachev was chosen. And I think this is an extremely important point, and I'd like to just share with you a little bit more evidence about it and then explain why I think this points to the next phase of research about the end of the Cold War. In the book, Conversations with Gorbachev, which Mikhail Sergeyevich wrote with his old friend, Zdeněk Milinarz, excuse me for my difficulty with that, but it's a really valuable, very slim volume in which the two of them sat down and recalled their old friendship and their motives, and I found that Gorbachev was very, very revealing in this volume. And he says, he was initially in favor in August of 1968 of sending in the Soviet tanks and crushing the Prague Spring. But then a year later, he went to Prague, to Czechoslovakia, as part of a Komsomol delegation, supposedly selected to talk to the young people and let them see the light. And people in factories turned their back on this delegation from Moscow. And Gorbachev says, with my own eyes, I saw the people did not accept what happened. People turned their backs on us. They didn't want to speak with us. For me, Gorbachev said, this was a shock. I suddenly understood that despite all the global, strategic, and ideological justifications for the Soviet repression, we had suppressed something that had grown up within our own society. So Gorbachev came to what he described himself as an unconsoling conclusion about the Soviet Union. He said, there was something wrong in our country. And I think that if you think about what Gorbachev was and who he was by the time he came to office in 1985, he had already formed these ideas about what use of force would mean and why he would not do it again. But Gorbachev's convictions, this particular one and many others, were a great mystery to the United States at the time he came to power in 1985. They should not have been, but they were. The then deputy director of the CIA, Robert Gates, revealed in his memoirs how little was known about Gorbachev in early 1985. He said the Americans immediately started asking the British and the Canadians, where Gorbachev had visited in the past 2 years, what had they heard about this new guy? In February of 1985, Gates wrote to his own analysts in the CIA, and I quote, I don't much care for the way we're writing about Gorbachev. We're losing the thread of what toughness and skill brought him to where he is. This is not some Gary Hart or even Lee Iacocca. We have to give the policymakers a clearer view of the kind of person they may be facing. Gates said that he felt Gorbachev was the heir to Andropov and the Suslov. Thus, Gates said Gorbachev, quote, could not be all sweetness and light. These have been two of the hardest cases in recent Soviet history. They wouldn't take a wimp under their wing. That's February of 1985, 3 weeks before Gorbachev came to power. That summer of 1985, June, July, the CIA finished its first assessment of Gorbachev. In power only a few months, I received the full assessment, unredacted, under the Freedom of Information Act for my book. But one of the interesting things about it is it was a rather reasonable assessment. It wasn't penetrating, but it did notice the new style in Gorbachev and that things were changing. CIA Director Bill Casey put a cover note on top of the assessment when he sent it to President Reagan. And in the cover note, he said, Mr. President, Gorbachev and those around him are not liberalizers or reformers in domestic or foreign policy. 1985. Casey was wrong. And there's one thing that did unfold in those early years, of course, Glasnost and Perestroika, which had their own logic, and the stronger they became, the more they began to dictate policy, the policy that was already really baked in the cake at the time Gorbachev was chosen. We didn't know what was baked in the cake, and we need to know, and this is my first major point, We need to know more about how Gorbachev came to these conclusions, and not in the crucible of decision-making in 1989 or 88, but actually in 1968 and in the 70s. And this is where I hope forthcoming biography and other research on Gorbachev will help us figure out how a guy who was really part of the system, who was not a radical and was not determined to tear it down, came to such important ideas much earlier. Now, my second point follows from this, because Tom's essay in the book shows how behind the curve the United States was in understanding Gorbachev, not in 1985, but 4 years later, with lots of experience, with lots of the crucible of decision-making. And, after Reykjavik, after Chernobyl, after the INF Treaty, after the Moscow Summit, after the Congress of People's Deputies, and all the things that have been described today, Tom shows us there was still what he calls, quote, poverty of imagination in Washington about this Soviet leader, and a persistent disbelief that Gorbachev was for real. And as Tom put it earlier, they were scared to death. But they were scared to death out of some weird feeling of insecurity about Gorbachev as a huckster, as a PR man. And this touches me very closely because I very vividly remember the day that I was a White House correspondent for the Washington Post, and Secretary Baker had just come back from a meeting, his first meeting with Gorbachev in Moscow in the spring of 1989, in the middle of that period called the pause, and the White House spokesman was asked about arms control proposal that Gorbachev had made to the secretary, in which he had rejected abruptly. And Fitzwater said, well, Gorbachev, he's just throwing out these arms control proposals like a dime store cowboy. And in his own memoirs, Mr. Fitzwater, who I respect very much, says that the minute he said it, he knew he was wrong. He went back to President Bush, opened the office of the Oval Door and said, Mr. President, I just made a mistake. I offer you my resignation. The president didn't take it, but this idea that was certainly in the public sphere in 1989, that Gorbachev was all show and not serious, was wrong. And I think that the errors of 85, the failure to understand Gorbachev, might be partially explained by secrecy and our difficulties of having human sources inside that system at that time. But by 1989, I feel that Tom's case is much stronger indictment, because we should have known. There was a lot more evidence. Now, that particular arms control proposal Gorbachev made in May of 1989 is a pretty good case study of this point. And Tom describes that Gorbachev made an offer to withdraw 500 tactical or short-range nuclear weapons from Europe. And, of course, this was at the time when the NATO alliance was debating whether to modernize their short-range weapons, the Lance missile. And Baker immediately rejected Gorbachev's proposal, partly because Gorbachev made it in public at a press conference, and Baker said, it must be just public relations. In fact, I point out in my book that Baker had been warned about it in private 2 or 3 days before. And interestingly, in my own research, I found that there was a staff memo written inside the Kremlin about this particular proposal. And of course, in the staff memo, it's acknowledged that there's a lot of politics in Europe, and if we make such an offer, it'll certainly help influence the outcome of the Lance missile debate in NATO. But the second point of this staff memo was, of course, to point out that in the event of a war, in the event of a conflict, these short-range missiles, short-range nuclear weapons on the front lines in Europe were actually the most dangerous. And I thought it was really fascinating to read this internal debate that these weapons actually should be pulled back because they're the ones that threaten us. And this particular staff analyst sitting in the Kremlin said, look, think about it. Our weapons on the front lines of this conflict move very slowly. NATO tanks, gas turbine engines, move pretty quick. The bottom line is the dynamic of these short-range weapons is we either got to use them or lose them in the first moments of a conflict. That's dangerous, no trouble. Let's get rid of them. And this memo went to Gorbachev. He made his proposal, and we rejected it. And I think that this kind of surprise that we faced in 1989 suggests that the pause was something we should continue to focus on, because, Tom, you described it as enabling, and certainly to the groups in Europe that took their cue from what they saw happening in Moscow and did what they did, both the elites and the grassroots did find some space there. But as a case study in American policy, it is really a policy of serious failure. And, I think that it's easy for us to point fingers at narrow things like CIA, intelligence failure, or ideology. You can point your finger at Reagan and say that he had ideological blinders on, and those things existed. But I think that there's a fresh picture that emerges from all the evidence in this book that is bigger than that, and one that applies to today and offers us a lesson of masterpieces of history for today. And it's this. The real villain here wasn't any specific intelligence agency or leader. It was a mindset. There was a Cold War mindset so deeply engraved on both sides that was so hard for anybody to believe, actually, that there'd be a deviation from that. And not only in Europe, but in other spheres such as nuclear arms control, the Cold War was sort of like a speeding locomotive in people's thinking. And it always went on the rails. And they were terribly stubborn about giving up that idea. And certainly Baker, in that key moment, I've asked him, I said, why did you think that Gorbachev was making this? He says, because I just know they always tried to divide America from Europe. It was just public relations. And I'm thinking, you just didn't have fresh thinking. It was really a poverty of imagination. And of course, on the Soviet side, we know that this was a place with a long tradition of locking up Xerox machines. It was not easy to get inside of it. So I would like to end by suggesting that one of the lessons for today of this entire more than decade-long bit of research is the real importance of breaking through mindsets and understanding who's on the other side and what they're thinking. And I've often asked myself, today, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, 4 opaque leaderships that are difficult to understand. Do we know more about them today than we knew about Gorbachev in 1985 or 1989? That's the real lesson of masterpieces of history. We have to be not only open-minded but vigilant, and as Reagan said, and my T-shirt says, trust but verify. So thanks for giving me the chance to.
Thank you all. This was an incredible, fascinating discussion and an incredibly fascinating book. I'm going to open it up to Q&A, and there's no shortage of questions, but please wait for the microphone and identify yourself. So we're going to start here with Wojtek. Yeah, just hold on for the mic, please.
Well, I just can't wait to read the book, and particularly those 2 essays. But in the meantime, I really admire the title, The Masterpieces of History, because it just encourages one to think. Certainly it was a masterpiece of history that the Cold War ended peacefully the way it did. And yet, as we have heard, so many people, practically everybody, got it wrong. Yeah? Tom, you have spoke about the myth, yeah? And Mr. Hoffman, I see very clearly, explained how the American leaders were wrong. Yeah? Gorbachev certainly deserves a lot of admiration, but he got it wrong too. Yeah? He didn't get his European house. He didn't want the Russia that eventually developed. So is there really anyone who got it right? And is there any country or institution that got it right? And I think there was, actually. Let's look at the European community. And if you want to take it personally, there was Jacques Delors, who was the president of the European Commission at that time. Well, there was one thing that the European community had, which the others did not. And it was a program for the future that it tried to implement and eventually implemented. I mean, we have the European Union there now, which grew out of it. And that was a program which goes back actually to the 1970s, to the idea that the community should be open to any European country. Seemed absurd in 1970. But in the 1980s, with the Single European Act, it was implied strongly that the door would be open also to these countries which Delors understood at the time were getting out of the Soviet fold. Yeah. Then Kohl may have been in Warsaw when the wall went down. But Delors, if I remember correctly, he was there was a meeting in Rhodes of the European community representatives, and they were debating about that plan, the economic plan for Poland and for Hungary, yeah, to be open to other countries, to bring them step by step into the community, yeah, slowly, because they will not be ready for a long time. But that was a long-term vision, which was not a single man's vision. It really developed over a period of time, and many people involved. But they were those who got it right. And they were those who really had the vision of Europe as it eventually developed. Not the Americans, not the Russians, but the West Europeans.
We'll just go that way. Yeah, right now.
Thank you, Wayne, Mary. All fascinating stuff. I very much look forward to reading this and other materials. Two comments from that period. One, I was the person who wrote the first draft of Reagan's Brandenburg Gate speech. I did it in the State Department, in the Office of German Affairs, under protests, saying that nothing we wrote in the State Department would be accepted in the White House. Reagan's speechwriters would write the speech. In fact, precious little of our draft got in. But the biggest single gap between our approach and what was finally given was audience. I wanted Reagan to in some way speak to the people of East Germany, where I had lived and served, and what the GDR was kind of my baby, my first sort of great interest. One of the reasons I got into the Foreign Service goes to the GDR. And what the White House wrote, of course, was a speech that talked over them. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Gorbachev, of course, had nothing to do with tearing down the wall. And the people who tore down the wall were not the people that Reagan was speaking to. And from that day up to when the wall came down and even beyond into German unification, if there's one thing where Washington had a total blind spot, it was the dynamics of the GDR, and that the GDR could even have dynamics. The notion that the GDR could be the place where the most dynamic things going on in the East Bloc would take place was regarded as risible nonsense. And this was a view that unfortunately was shared in some other capitals, I think, including Bonn. But if there's anything about 1989 where the U.S. had a blind spot, it was in believing that anything that happened in East Berlin was somehow controlled by Moscow, whereas Moscow had no control over it at all. And just as a second point, you talked
quickly, please.
Yeah, you talked a bit about these fears that the Bush administration had. Many of them, not all of them were unreasonable fears. But I would just say that continued well on through 91, even into 92. And trying to separate, when I was in Moscow then, trying to separate the real fears, the realistic fears of the breakup of the Soviet Union from the unrealistic fears is a major part of the dynamic within sort of analysis and decision-making during that period, because not all the fears were illegitimate fears.
Right. Mel and then Jeff right there.
I'm Mel Leffler. I'm a public policy scholar this year at the Wilson Center. I've read both those essays and many of the documents, and this is truly a fantastic volume with two great essays. Tom, though, I have a question for you. In your remarks today, you said nothing about SDI, and I'm wondering, just to play devil's advocate with you, could one say that Gorbachev missed a great opportunity by dwelling on SDI, that at Reykjavik, if he had accepted a deal, he would have moved hugely in the direction that he might have wanted to go, and he also would have put Reagan and his advisors in an incredible bind. And
Not Reagan, but certainly his advisors.
yeah, well, created this incredible rift between Reagan and his advisors, since most of them thought Reagan was out of his mind talking in this framework. So maybe you can answer that precise question, but also talk more generally about the role of SDI and how it shaped Gorbachev's thoughts. And I have a question for David Hoffman, whose book I also liked very much. But, you know, when you say that, you know, fears were exaggerated in the Bush administration, or yet in your own book, you have that whole last part of the book about the Soviet chemical warfare. And although the United States probably didn't know a whole lot about the details, nonetheless, they had suspicions about the magnitude. And you yourself are awed by the magnitude of what was going on there. So as a result of that, does one need to step back and think that and question whether some of these embedded assumptions about Cold War mindset were legitimized by the very presence of the types of weaponry that still existed, were actually, I think, increasing even in the mid and late 1980s, and that you so beautifully describe in your own book?
Jeff, and then you'll, if you guys can answer. Go ahead.
Jeffrey Herr from the University of Maryland. Tom Blanton, you mentioned, I look forward to reading the collection as well, that you had conferences or focused on 1953, 56, 68, 80, 81 in Poland, and then 89. And what I missed, so my first question is whether you examined the Battle of the Euro missiles from 79 to 83. I wrote a book about it, and I both looked at a lot of publicly available documents then and interviewed many people, and officials, especially in Europe, thought that this was the most important political battle in Europe in the history of the Cold War, and one of the most important events of the Cold War around the globe, and that it was the decisive turning point in the history of the Cold War from 1968 to 89. It was, in their view, the precondition, the necessary precondition for the fall of the hardliners in Moscow and the emergence of Gorbachev, and that if the Battle of the Euro missiles had turned out differently, if the NATO deployments had collapsed and the Soviets had kept the SS-20s, Gromyko and Brezhnev and Andropov would have been confirmed that military force and the threat of force was a useful political tool, and that the Soviet Union might still be standing. So it's striking to me, you've spoken for an hour, and there was no mention of that, and yet you confidently spoke about the myth of Western pressure. So I would be interested to hear what Svetlana Savinskaya would have to say about those, the consequences of 1983. And the second point is a general methodological issue that I'm sure that you've thought about a lot, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. As someone who's worked in a lot of archives, we know that there are thousands and thousands of documents. And so my question to you is, what's the value of a collection like this? Because we all know that a Politburo meeting or a document is in the context of hundreds of other documents which make it sensible and that are not available to the reader of a book like this. But it's a very impressive accomplishment, and congratulations.
Why don't you guys answer those set of questions, and then we'll take some more, if there's still time.
Maybe I'll just work backwards really quickly. Our publisher protested the size of the book already, 730 pages. And so there's only so much room, and I would say just methodologically, we all have to pick and choose our evidence. And so I think that our obligation, simply as scholars and teachers and students and journalists, is to explain on what basis we're making our choices. And that's the best you can do. It's not that we're objective, we're not. I mean, most scholarly research is driven by some hypothesis or some pre-existing belief that makes you want to find out the answer. And so sometimes you're proven wrong, and if you're open to that, that's great. But methodologically, when I say tip of the iceberg, I really mean that. There is a huge amount of material that we have read from which we chose this material. I mean, Svetlana mentioned she's read every Politburo, and whatever else you can, from 85 to 91, whatever else you can say, that's quite a data set from which to draw some conclusions about what the Politburo talked about, how they talked to each other, and even compare those conversations to all the MIMCONs. When Gorbachev is speaking to Thatcher or to Mitterrand, he's speaking to a peer. And it's phenomenally frank and candid, and it's quite different discourse than when he's speaking in the Politburo. And this is in itself an objective lesson about Gorbachev and says some things. On Euro missiles, yes, we've spent quite a lot of time working on Euro missiles and getting the documents out. It's a huge subject. I'm well aware of your own excellent book and other people's great work. My only counter, it's not to say this is dispositive, but simply to pose the counterfactual. If Andropov had lived, I don't think any European leader would say, oh, the Battle of the Euro missiles was the clincher of the Cold War. And Andropov was 2 years younger than Reagan. Andropov could have lived until 92. And can anybody imagine 89 happening the way it happened with the butcher of Budapest in charge in Moscow? No, it wouldn't have been that way. You wouldn't be able to look back at Euro missiles and say that was the turning point. I don't think it was. But that's a good way to ask a student to investigate the question, though. You're onto something. Mel, with SDI, you wrote this in For the Soul of Mankind, and I think you were right on target, which is if Gorbachev at Reykjavik had said yes to the sharing of SDI, we would have had a completely different trajectory at the end of the Cold War. Reagan, I believe, was entirely sincere. He said it at Geneva. He said it at Reykjavik. It was only Caspar Weinberger and the people in the Pentagon who couldn't believe it every time they heard it. Reagan said, the only reason I proposed SDI was to share it with the Soviets, because the enemy here is nuclear weapons. It's not each other. He had that wonderful toast in Geneva at the banquet where he says, if there was an alien life form coming in on Halene's comet that was going to threaten our world, we and the Soviets would get together. He's toasting Gorbachev at Geneva. We'd get together and fight back. Well, in fact, that alien life force was with us. It was nuclear weapons. And the most fascinating interaction, and we pointed out in this book, is the way Gorbachev then refers to that toast in his speech to the Party Congress in February 1986. He takes Reagan's point and quotes Reagan. Says, see, yes, we have to have cooperation to deal with the huge threats that face us. So, yes, he should have said, I'll share SDI with you, Mr. President. And Jack Matlock has said this. He was there interpreting, so he should know as well. It was a big mistake and a missed opportunity. Gorbachev didn't do it because he just didn't trust enough. And that's David's point about the Cold War mindsets. He himself would go there and then pull back, and go there and pull back. And so that's a hard one. Wayne, I think you're absolutely right that not all fears are illegitimate, and there certainly were a few. I'm reminded of an amazing sign on the streets, was it in Prague perhaps, where they said, Poland, 10 years, Hungary, 10 months, East Germany, 10 weeks, Czechoslovakia, 10 days. The acceleration of history in the revolutions. And it did have that feel of spinning out of control. It wasn't illegitimate. But I think the argument we make, and then I'm very encouraged to hear David really reinforcing this, because he really knows, is this extraordinary sense of the missed opportunities for an arms race in reverse. George Bush finally makes the unilateral withdrawal of all the tactical nuclear weapons from the Navy ships and foreign bases in September 1991. It's the biggest move away from doomsday midnight of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist clock in its entire history. That is a move that Gorbachev would have welcomed, says Yakovlev to Jack Matlock in July 1989. Years went by in which Gorbachev progressively lost the ability to deliver on his side. The whole world today, fissile material and otherwise, would be so much safer if we'd had any clue at the time. You're absolutely right about the GDR. There's a wonderful review essay about Phil Zelikow and Condi Rice's book about reunification, which remarks it's amazing that a story of these extraordinary diplomatic events can be written with so little reference to the streets of Leipzig, where these things were happening. And in Wojtek, who got it right? let me just say a kind word for the CIA. I know you don't expect this, and very few people really do. But there's this wonderful CIA estimate that we put in this book because in April 1989, the CIA actually wrote an estimate, circulated through the community, couldn't get consensus on it, but they said there is a significant disagreement within the community. On the one hand, there are a bunch of people, and it doesn't say who they are, but we know their names: Robert Gates, Brent Scowcroft, to a certain extent the president, the hardliners, the neoconservatives, Dick Cheney, those names. They believe Gorbachev's a fake. He's just trying to get us to let down our guard. He's going to resume the competition. That's what they say. Other analysts in the intelligence community, and I think this is the Doug McKechins and many of the career analysts who were trying to read what Gorbachev actually said. We did have a huge amount of evidence by that point from all the summits and from all the speeches and from all the back channel stuff of who this guy was. Said he's making fundamental change in Soviet thinking. He's fundamentally redirected the sense of national interest. He's ready to let go of Eastern Europe. This is April of 1989. So some people got it right. It's just they were ignored, they were censored, and as McKechen said in a piece of congressional testimony, if I'd come into my deputy director with this kind of analysis, he would have thrown it across the room at me. That's a guy named Robert Gates.
I just like I just like to respond to two of your points. The pause of 1989 and Bush's caution and prudence. I think the criticism is on the nuclear side, that he inherited from Reagan already a somewhat stalled process in late '88. Gorbachev accelerated it with the conventional pullbacks of the UN speech, but the argument there is, was it possible for Bush to move in early 1989 to essentially capitalize on what Reagan had done on the nuclear side? And I think it was. On the chemical weapons, that again, chemical weapons, not biological, was already also moving relatively toward transparency. But the biological weapons of the Soviet Union were only vaguely suspected in 1989 until October. So in this year that we're talking about, in October, there was a defector, Vladimir Pasechnik, who told the British a lot of what was going on. And that information, I think, got over to the United States in the autumn. I don't know exactly when. At Malta, Bush doesn't raise it. And I guess I would come back at you and say, I think that at that point, George Bush knows about this information, and the hour is late. And he's also not gotten anywhere on the nuclear front. Europe is changing rapidly. And there he had a different problem, which is, should he raise it? With Germany in play, with the nuclear business basically stalled, was it prudent for him to meet with, and should he have raised it publicly? And here there was an enormous debate, and they had suddenly been presented with this whole ugly underside of the arms race, this data that there were bugs in bombs in the basement, and yet there were the plate was full, and Bush and Baker decided essentially to keep it very, very quiet, which the Soviet Union had done for all those years. So you have this odd confluence of events where essentially prudence dictated again, keeping it very quiet. And in fact, sadly, this goes on for quite some time till the collapse of the Union and afterwards. And it's part of the thing about biological weapons that there was not someone who stood up in public in this period and said, there's this thing exists, it's really bad. And we heard about it really first from Alabek after the collapse of the Union. And I'd just like to make one quick comment on SDI and your question about SDI, because it's a good one about whether Gorbachev should have just said, okay, forget it, Trump card, I'll take the 50%, let's have it. But I would just remind you, and I know from your own work, you've read the preparatory stuff for Reykjavik and Gorbachev's mind was a bit of a gambit, right? It was a trap, really, for Reagan. And you see that he essentially says, we'll put all the stuff that Reagan wants, the 50% cuts, we'll dangle it all on there, and then we'll trade it. And he very skillfully springs the trap on the Sunday at the very end of the whole process. I mean, the entire thing went somewhat according to the plan before the summit that he had laid and which Reagan failed to prepare for and failed to anticipate. But the interesting thing is that could Gorbachev then have broken with the plan, because the plan called for him, if he didn't get the deal, to come out and attack Reagan. Before he went, he told the Politburo, if he doesn't agree, we'll have another chance to really pummel him. And I wonder, it's counterfactual, but could Gorbachev have, at that very moment, actually made the deal for the cuts without bringing anything home? I doubt it, although afterwards, literally walking to the press conference, he decides he is not going to execute the plan of attack. It's over at that point. They didn't have a deal. But, in this very narrow time frame in which Gorbachev makes these intense decisions, in the negotiation, could he have given up on his instructions? And then why did he immediately afterwards?
I have two short points. One is the question of SS-20s and the Pershings in Europe and whether this was the major battle of the Cold War. I have a little interesting aspect, I think, that I see in Gorbachev coming to power with a certain mindset. And David pointed out that that would be very important to see where his thinking started and how it changed. Well, Gorbachev's formative period in Moscow is really under the tutelage of Andropov, and especially in 1983, when Andropov gives him more and more responsibility for foreign policy, brings him in, trying to signal that this is my successor. But with that, in that period, they go through the period of nuclear scare, which was very real in the Soviet Union because of the debate about the deployment and then actual decision to deploy in November. I think what's happening is that creates in Gorbachev, who before that was the Secretary for Agriculture, a lot of sense of threat, and this is also the year of SDI. So SDI combined with the deployment of the Euro missiles creates this awareness of a possibility of a real nuclear war in Gorbachev, and that is what he brings with him to when he becomes General Secretary. But then two things happen with this sense of threat. First of all, he meets with Reagan in Geneva and then Reykjavik, and he realizes that this is not a guy who's going to attack us. In fact, he shares my deepest dream of nuclear abolition, and with him, very deep arms control is possible. And so that takes care of part of the sense of threat, and he partly starts understanding that Reagan believes in SDI as the ultimate protection from nuclear weapons. And the second thing that happens is that Soviet scientists persuade Gorbachev that SDI is not even possible to achieve in any foreseeable future. So before Gorbachev actually negotiates on INF, he has to untie the package, which binds together ABM, which means no conversation about SDI, the strategic weapons, and the INF, the intermediate range. Well, he is able to untie this weapon only after internally he steps over, or he gets out of this threat perception from the U.S. side. Even though, yes, before he says that the Pershings are like a pistol at our temple. Yes, but even that is not enough for him to say, okay, let's negotiate on them. It's the sense of threat that he possibly learned during this 1983 nuclear scare from Andropov, from that setting, that he has to overcome before he can make that decision. So I don't see the Pershings, the Euro missiles, as such a factor. It might have been a factor in creating this sense of threat in him in 1983 combined with SDI, but it's not a factor in him actually deciding to sign this agreement and make huge concessions and cut disproportionately more Soviet weapons than the U.S. weapons. And then just very short comment on who got it right. Yes, Jacques Delors and the European community, clearly they were able to build the European home, although I disagree with what Wojtek said about their initial desire to take in East Europeans. In fact, there was a lot of resistance, and it was a very slow process, and that's why NATO option was offered, because the European Union was not crazy about taking those East Europeans in the beginning. But I think the person who got it right, and I am really amazed at his political capacity, his perception of events at the time, is Kohl, Helmut Kohl. He understood what was going on, and he really took a gamble. He took the initiative with the 10 points, and we published on our website a really intriguing story about how the 10 points actually came from a Soviet proposal, which was not shared with Gorbachev. So Gorbachev didn't know it was a Soviet proposal, but Kohl thought it was. So Kohl goes with the 10 points to the Bundestag, and then right after that he goes to Brussels summit. And practically everyone at the Brussels NATO summit was against the 10 points, was against moving too fast. But Kohl, skillfully, he negotiates with each of them, with each of NATO partners in Europe, and he gives them something that they want. For example, to Mitterrand and to the French, he gives the idea, oh, you wanted the idea of Europe, united Europe, European integration, monetary integration, the idea of euro. We can do it. You can't do it with Gorbachev. Your idea with Gorbachev of the common European home won't work. But with me, with Germans, if Germany is united, then we can create a united Europe. Then he turns to Gorbachev and persuades Gorbachev, you need economic aid, we're willing to give you any guarantees, any assurances, and instant economic aid. Now, food aid. Gorbachev is complaining about possible famine. He sends them right away and becomes Gorbachev's strongest partner in Europe and gets his unification. And I think what Kohl did and the way he moved shows that he understood more than probably anybody else at that time.
I mean, just before I turn it back to the audience, you spoke a lot about what was going on, from at the top level. And what I was wondering, especially because I've heard you talk, both you and Svetlana talk about the people of Eastern Europe and their role in getting those events out and creating those events and making them happen. How do you put that in document? How do you make that visible in a documentary volume? And how can you how do you show that in this collection as opposed to just, being there at the time or sort of reading the memoirs or reading the newspaper articles of the time? So.
It's really hard to do. I mean, I think when we try to teach this in various courses that we've done, and you've lectured in many of them, I've done it here at a course that Mel put together. We show people video of the time that was on television. We show them some of the original documents, so they sit in the room with some of the leaders. We did an exhibition with Jim Hirschberg of the protest posters of 1989. All these are components. Because the great challenge is, how do you put yourself back at that moment and recapture some of that contingency? And how do you get the feel that you can only have when you don't know how it's going to come out? And that's a perpetual problem, I think, for every teacher of history, every teacher of our